All right, and we're now recording. So thank you for attending the Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture Wednesday webinars. We offer these the second and fourth Wednesday of each month at noontime Eastern Standard Time. And today we're going to be talking about farm record keeping. I'm Shannon Dill with University of Maryland Extension, and I'll be the presenter for today. Also listed on here are the rest of the webinars for the rest of the year. We have something on health insurance, marketing, farm lease agreements, GMOs, and looking at business structures. So those are available on the website, and then of course all the recordings from previous webinars are there in the blue link, extension.umd.edu/womeninag. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture program, as well as our collaborators on that. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to share my screen for my presentation here. So you should be seeing the farm record keeping and my contact information. I have my email here, and I'll have it on the last slide too if anyone wants to send me any emails. If there's any templates that I show that you'd like me to share, I can send those as well. So what I'm going to be talking about today, just briefly discuss the importance of farm records, and I think everyone's listening because we realize how important record keeping is. It's essential to the farm. There's regulatory issues. So we're going to talk just a little bit about that. What farm records to keep. We're going to break those into personal, production, and financial. And then at the end, just maybe some tips on how to manage the farm records, because that definitely takes some time to manage those and organize our farm records. So record keeping generally isn't the funnest thing that we all get to do for our jobs, for our businesses, but they're very, very important. So we need proof. The IRS may ask for revenue, expenses, and inventory items, so we need the proof of with our records, using our records. They can help as decision aids. So records may help with making decisions on capital purchases, equipment, land, maybe hiring employees or reducing staff, and also enterprises, possibly expanding an enterprise or maybe not expanding and reducing an enterprise. So they can help with decisions. There's institutional requirements, so lending agencies, farm service agency, crop insurance, all of those require records on a regular basis if you're working with them. And then we also have environmental regulations. Depending on your state and location, you may have requirements on nutrient management, pesticide application, if anyone uses biosolids, irrigation, the use of water, they may require record keeping. So again, it's very, very important that we have good, solid records for those reasons. So moving into the types of records that we keep, I've broken them down into a couple different things. This website here, SNEED, they had a great listing of all of these different types of records and what type of personal records you would keep at home. So there's records to keep and never throw out. These are permanent records like your tax returns, your legal documents, your vital records, birth, marriage certificates, all of those type of things, retirement, investments, all of those are things that you keep permanently. For business records, again, another permanent file with your financials, any legal documents, licenses that you may carry. Those again would be created as a permanent file. And I still have not given up complete paper, so I scan a lot of these and I have them scanned and saved, but for the most part I have these paper-based as well. Tax records, they recommend a 6 years minimum, and the IRS can go back 6 years to actually audit you, so all of that supporting documentation that goes with your tax returns, you would want to keep minimally for 6 years. The next is everyday paperwork, at least 3 years that you would keep those. Those are your monthly financials, your credit card statement, utilities, medical bills, anything that has been reconciled that aren't, currently open or an issue. And then there's many that are kind of uncategorized as far as the year limit goes. So, vehicles, you keep it until it's sold. Credit cards, you keep those until they're reconciled. Policies and warranties until they expire. So keeping all of those will be important. Having a shredder or using the community shredding services is really great. So, I have a small shredder that I use, um, as I go monthly. Maybe I'm shredding credit card offers or some of those type of sensitive documents. But then if I do an annual file cleanup, I might have a box that needs to be shredded. So using something like the community shredding services are often offered by financial institutions. They have a vehicle that goes around and shreds those for you. Again, Smead had some great information on office and file organization and how to organize those. So that was really good. And then a note here is this is just kind of general purpose guidelines. It really does not include any unusual or extenuating circumstances. So say you have a medical bill that's still open, you would want to keep that for longer. So really record keeping, I know this isn't necessarily farm oriented, but I'm a big proponent of if your personal finances and your personal records are in place and you have a good system for that, it is going to trickle over into your farm. And oftentimes, they do go back and forth. And so having those in order is really important. And this is a great time of year, coming into the end of the year to start looking at filing systems and how you're organizing the farm. So there's kind of the personal piece of it. Now I want to talk about keeping farm records. And there's three basic types of farm records that I'd like to discuss. And those are the resource inventories, production accounts or livestock and crop operations, and income and expense, so your financial records. So we'll go ahead and look at the resource inventories. Count and assign a value to your resources and equipment on your farm. So for your resources, we're talking about equipment, land, implements, all of those type of things that you own. And resources are your assets. They're items that you own, and it includes the liabilities along with those, so what you may owe on those assets. So why would you inventory? You may need to determine your net worth. So if you're going to go to a lender and want to borrow money, the first thing, or one of the first things they're going to ask you about is a current balance sheet, and that will give them what your net worth is, and that includes your assets. Everything that you own, you need to assign a value to. It might help compute non-cash expenses such as depreciation. So with your taxes, you're going to need to share a list of your equipment and resources and things that you use on the farm, so you can depreciate those resources. And then the other is that, again, it assists with taxes, it assists with insurance. So if you're going to insure, things that are in your barn, if you're going to do it implement by implement, you need to have a list of those resources for your insurance agent. And it can also help with purchasing decisions. So say you've had a piece of equipment for 15 years or 20 years over the useful life, you can start making some decisions on if you want to purchase another piece of equipment. So this is what an equipment inventory might look like. The top one here is maybe more of a Word type document where it has boxes. The second is my favorite, is Excel, and we're going to talk a little bit about spreadsheet design. But there might be some other things that you would want to add. So you have the equipment name, the model, the size, year of purchased, the condition of it, ownership, whether you bought it, if you're leasing it, if you're Did you buy it new? There's a lot of information out there about determining value, whether you use the book value or a market value. You might add in the original purchase price, so what you paid for this piece of equipment. Perhaps you want a tag number, VIN number, the serial or ID number on it so you can identify that piece of equipment. Include everything. Again, anything that kind of has the machine, the implements that go along with it. All of those will be good to have if you need, again, to work with your accountant, do your taxes, work with an insurance agent. And then having photos of that, especially for insurance purposes, having good photos of the equipment that you're using. This is an example of perhaps a building and structure inventory. So you have a list, say you have a number of buildings or structures there on the farm. You know, what is the purpose of it? What's the square feet? What are the features of it? Where's the location? Maybe the expense to build if you put a loan on this piece of structure or improvement. And then again, having some pictures of the buildings and structures. So if there were some insurance claims or IRS questions, you would have some proof of that building and structure. All right. Any questions so far? Hopefully everyone's hearing me okay. I think there's maybe some audio issues someone's having. Okay. So the next one is projected equipment purchasing schedule. So this is another kind of resource inventory looking forward. If there's things that you wanted to purchase, this is part of a case study. You'll see a couple of these spreadsheets as we go through. But this might be something, especially if you're expanding, if you're getting started, you can't buy everything in the first year. And you may want to spread it out for depreciation or tax purposes. Perhaps there's a way that you can borrow equipment in the beginning, or perhaps lease or rent equipment in the beginning to get you by. So this is an example of what might be a projected equipment schedule as you're making purchases. All right, so moving from kind of the resource inventory, the next thing we're going to talk about are production records. And these are used to measure and report the performance of a crop and livestock enterprise on the farm. So for crop records, if you're growing crop records, soil conditions, cropping patterns, field layouts, and building locations might be what you want to record. Perhaps it's crop rotation, varieties that you're using, yields, fertilizer rates, and pesticide applications. For livestock, perhaps it's mortality, breeding, performance, feed information, health information. And then you may want to keep labor records. So the amount and time required per operation, whether you have employees or not, you should be keeping at least some amount of labor records on your farm. How long does it take to harvest? How long is it taking to planting? Are you pruning? Are you, are you looking at how many times how long does it take you to move livestock through, their shots or their shot schedule, or if you have poultry, how long is it taking you per day for dead bird pickup, that type of thing. And again, why? Taxes, insurance, perhaps it's regulatory, pricing, again, production decisions, maybe purchasing decisions, and that way you can track expenses. So this is, again, a broad, we're going to look at some examples of what production records would look like. Here's a production plan that was created, again, for the case study. This was created so we could keep a record of through the year what we were going to be doing as far as the farm goes. And for records, they're kind of grouped into categories of projections and then actual. And so you may have two documents or another column that says what actually happened. because we know what we plan on doing doesn't always happen. So having a projection, so you have a plan in place, and then you can then create the actual. And we'll show a couple examples of how that might work. So this is a production plan. This is for kind of, this is a case study where we have the greenhouse and then some outdoor mini vegetables and some berries. So we're kind of looking from a production side, a marketing side, and then where we might add in some capital purchases. This is a yearly harvest schedule. People who grow multiple products may try to create something like this so they can plan for marketing, so they can maybe communicate with their consumers when different products would be available through the year. There's a number of these available through, I think this is from Alabama. We have one through University of Maryland Extension that's kind of very similar. And again, it's helpful when you're trying to make decisions with customers and buyers of what might be available on the farm. So a chart like this is fairly easy to create in something like Excel or even Word, and then easily edited through consecutive years. Here's a sample sheet for grain crops for a production record. And so here in Maryland, we have to keep and report the amount of fertilizer that we use. And this is an example that the top spreadsheet is the farm, the field number, the acreage in those fields, what crop was grown, how much fertilizer was applied, and then we can divide it up into, it's done by total fertilizer, and based on University of Maryland recommendations, and then that has to be reported to the Department of Agriculture. So this is a way to keep that and report that on an annual basis. Down here on the right is an example for green crops, how you might look at tickets. So these are the ticket number, what farm the crop came off of, what the crop was, how many bushels, and what was the price received. And we can do that then by the acreage, and you can get average yield per acre. You can also use Excel to average prices or do a weighted average on prices, so you can see what the price was received. So a bit of a summary for production records. Again, with crops, you may be interested in having a production schedule. You may need to report your production for crop insurance, fertilizer applications, pesticide applications. You may have to keep records for certification, so food safety, GAPS training, that type of organic certification. All of those need specific records that need to be kept. Again, looking at projections, very helpful to create those projections. When you're creating cash flow statement, you need to have those projections in place. And then also sales. So you may want to keep record of sales that were actually happening. Livestock, again, breeding, health, sales projections, your actual manure. And in Maryland, again, we keep very specific records about the amount of manure that was generated on the farm, that moved off the farm, and then that was applied on the fields, on cropping fields. Maybe it's mortality that you're keeping track of, and feeding. Feeding costs for livestock is your #1 expense, and so keeping track of that is important. Other things that you can keep track of, and I've seen people use, is water, whether you're using irrigation or say you have a poultry house that you're have automatic waterers. You're keeping track of the amount of water. Perhaps it's electric, especially through the winter with greenhouses. You're keeping maybe daily. I've seen it with daily temperature and the amount of electric being used on a daily basis. So again, projections can be made year after year. Enterprise budgets is something that I'll show a chart on, but those are helpful to have per enterprise. And then there may be also importance in keeping inventory. Inventory is very important if you're carrying over year to year because it will affect your tax statements. And so having an inventory of what's stored, what's in the freezer, what will be carried over if you carry product over year to year will be important. So here is an example. This comes from, I think, one of the farm credits, and from extension kind of merged is production records. And here's creating projected and actual. So crop production plan, you can see crop to be raised, acres to be planted, projected yield. So you can get kind of your projections in place, and then you would come back and do an actual. So there would be two sheets. One is your projection, then you would come back and make modifications for what was actually done. Here is an example for a projected livestock production plan. And again, you would come back and do an actual. Excel makes this very easy to create these charts, to copy them year to year, and with the ability to put equations in there so you can sum. So see here in column C, you can do A plus B, and it'll automatically make those changes for you and those calculations for you. So very, very helpful. All right, so we've talked about resource inventories. We've talked some about production records. The next is financial records to keep. And I think when you think about farm record keeping, it's one of the top ones that come to mind. And I'm going to break this into a couple different categories here. One is creating enterprise budgets. So it's your crop and livestock crop budgets. The next are your financial statements that you'll use. Those are used internally or with your lender, your balance sheet, your cash flow, and your income statement. When people are starting out, categorizing expenses by the IRS at minimum. And so anyone, these two guides are very, very helpful. And so if you haven't taken some time to look through publication 225, it's the Farmer's Tax Guide written by the IRS. It had some very good information about how to keep records, what records to keep, and then the Schedule F, your 1040, is your profit and loss from farming. So when you do claim farming on your tax returns, this is the schedule that you would complete. So those are the categories in which you'll be grouping your financial records. So again, at minimum, having those Schedule F categories will be important. And then you'll probably want to break them down more. So an example on the Schedule F might be insurance. Well, you purchase home insurance, you've got farm insurance, you have auto insurance, you have liability insurance. So you may want to break your financial record keeping, so your cash flow records, into multiple categories. Perhaps you want to do it by crops and classes, which I've seen people do. So perhaps they have a poultry enterprise, and then they also have a greenhouse or field crops, and they do maybe custom services. So there are ways in financial record keeping systems to group those separately. And that way you have those grouped out so you can measure them. But then when you report that farm to the IRS, it would be based on, feed or fertilizer or seed. So it would be grouped that way. Those that are doing small and specialty crops might want to group them within their financial by spring, summer, and fall crops. So it really depends by farm how you might group your financial record keeping system so you can make decisions, but then you would categorize them at least by the IRS minimum. So like sales, you might have sales from multiple different crops or multiple enterprises on the farm. You may want those broken down when you actually do your financial record keeping, so you can make decisions. However, the IRS is just going to see all of those receipts lumped together as income. So let's backtrack some and go back to enterprise budgets. And this is an example of from the case study that we did. It was for the berries, year 2. This is for 3 acres outside plus 1 greenhouse or high tunnel. And the budgets there's some examples, some great examples out there. And you can do them on a per acre, a per bushel, a per head, a per pound, per dozen, per square foot. You can divide them into any item of measurement. But this is really helpful when you start grouping and keeping your financial records, is especially for projections, to have these budgets in place so I can group my fertilizer expenses, and I can make those projections on how much will fertilizer cost, how much are the plants going to cost, how much is fuel going to cost, how much would labor be. And so having these enterprise budgets line by line is very helpful for projections. Here's an example of a balance sheet. So again, going to back to the resource inventory is very, very helpful. Having the equipment, having properties, the barns, buildings, structures, livestock, any inventory held over, all of those would be added here on a balance sheet. And it's broken into current, intermediate, and long-term. And it's just a snapshot in time. So it does change, might not change daily, but maybe week to week or month to month as you make payments on, say, a liability. That would change as an asset depreciates or loses value. That may change. So the balance sheet is, again, another helpful document. Do these monthly? No. Generally, a balance sheet is done once a year or by lender request. Here's the cash flow budget that kind of goes along with the enterprise budget. It's really impossible to create something like this without any type of records or other types of spreadsheets or charts that you've made. So I think you've already figured out that there's no one template or document that's going to do everything for your farm record keeping. It's going to be a mix of things. And so an example here is looking like, your labor here on line 13. You're going to need to be keeping your labor records through the year and have a projection of how much labor you might need or time. You'll need production costs to complete row 8, 9, and 10 for how much your production supplies and production expenses would be. And you would need a marketing budget for line 18. How much is it going to cost to run ads or transportation to a farmer's market, or the expenses related to, direct marketing or wholesale marketing? And so when you start looking at documents like this, you have to work backwards. Number 21 is your family living and withdrawals. So we were, that kind of goes back to the personal. How much does it cost your family to, what is your household budget? And what type of family living and withdrawals will you need? Your capital purchases. So again, all of these spreadsheets really are going, and these documents, these records really work together. So it kind of leads me to this managing farm records. You can keep records on anything. So many types of records that could be kept. Is it telephone time? Is it customers? Is it keeping track of, the customer database with their emails? Is it keeping track of, financials? There are minimum things that are necessary to keep, whether it's tax-based or regulatory-based. If you have your pesticide license, you have to keep your pesticide records. If you're applying nutrients in Maryland, we have to keep our nutrient application records. But then there's those that are really helpful for you as a farm business. Do you want to add a new employee? Do you want to add a really expensive piece of equipment? There are records that you can keep to help you make those decisions. So ultimately, needing to find a way to organize it so you can find the information quickly and that it's easy to use. And you can spend a lot of time creating these softwares or templates or record keeping and finding the best mix of those to use. I want to share some computer options that are available. These are the ones that I'll be going through: Microsoft templates, some Excel documents, the financial record keeping through Quicken or QuickBooks. There's a lot of apps out there now, and there is some farm software that's hitting the market. FarmWorks has been around for years that kind of helps with commodity crops, but there's other type of small farm software record keeping that's hitting the streets. So one of my favorite places to start if I'm looking at creating a template is Microsoft. Whether you go to their web-based templates or you click new, there's a lot of ideas that are there, whether it's calendars, labor records, inventory, purchasing orders, invoices. All of those are available on Microsoft, and you can then download them and then customize them for your farm business. So that's a great place to start, is Microsoft Office and templates. The next, and maybe you want a blank spreadsheet. So there are some things within Excel that make it really great. It helps organize. It helps with formulas. So if there's a formula that you're repeating over and over again, or a record keeping that you're repeating over again, that helps. And it can do some graphing. So there is a wonderful help feature, and I often have to do it with a number of the formulas I use on a regular basis. Count is one of them, so it'll count the number of cells that I've added in. Maybe it's a weighted average. So if I'm pricing bushels, I want a weighted average. I don't want just this event at the farmer's market, I got this price, but how much did I sell? I want a weighted average to know what was my weighted average over the season. And maybe it's percent change. So if I'm looking year to year. And so often I have to look up those equations. And through the help feature, I can just say, you know, weighted average equation, and Microsoft will help me create that equation for me. It can help create, so I would recommend creating a workbook with worksheets within it. So here you see participant sheet 2 summary 2014, 15, 16, 17. That is one workbook where I'm tracking. This is actually the webinar workbook that I use, and I track all of the webinars that we offer, the number of participants for the webinar. And instead of creating a new document each time, I'm creating these worksheets within a big workbook. They can begin to talk to each other. So if I want to add up things year to year, I can do it in like something like a summary, which is really helpful. I can copy the workbook and then make it for the next year, so I don't have to recreate it from square one. All the equations are still in there, and you can rename them however you need to rename it. I think you can even color code these tabs within Excel. Very, very helpful. Save as. So especially if it's financial, often I'll save as, and I'll do, say, the name of the workbook. So maybe it's crops, and I'll underscore, and I'll put the date in. And that date helps me remember that that's the most recent version. Even though I have older versions, it does help me at times, depending on how often you're updating it. So an example is a balance sheet. I keep the balance sheet named for each year that I update it, and then I can go back and kind of benchmark myself. So I've got the new balance sheet. Okay, so there is a question about a workbook. Yes, it is the same as the same folder with multiple worksheets in it. So An Excel workbook is one document that's got multiple worksheets within it. So if you create an Excel folder named crops and you keep creating a new file, that is a little bit, it's actually a little bit different. A workbook is the one document, and then the worksheets are the sheets within that workbook. And there's some wonderful community colleges that offer some Excel classes. It really can do a lot of things for you as you get kind of comfort and some comfort level with it. Copy functions are great because, again, you set up a worksheet that you really like or a record sheet that you really like, you can copy it over and over again. Filter functions for headings. So this little filter icon here that I have copied, I will highlight a heading and I will hit that filter, and then I can sort things by crop. I could sort them by the date. I could sort them by the price. And that's very, very easily, again, to get data as you need it. And then graphing, many of us don't necessarily need the graphs, but sometimes it's good to put them things side by side to make decisions. So this is just one that I created real quickly today on webinar statistics. We keep information on number of webinars, total registrants, and that's very, very helpful. So this is just some examples of how Excel might help with farm record keeping. And the next is with QuickBooks or Quicken. Probably most people have heard about these two financial keeping software. These are not going to keep your crop records. They're not going to keep your livestock health records. This keeps mostly it's set up for finances. It manages accounts payable, receivable. If you have employees, it does payroll or the 1099 feature. It will create for you a Schedule F if you're categorizing and you're categorizing things appropriately when you put those in. It does make it very easy to reconcile or produce reports. It can do enterprise accounting. So say you have one bank account, but you're doing, you've got egg production and you've got a greenhouse and you've got a CSA. You could create classes within that and give each income or expense a class that it would go under to keep track of enterprises. It will write checks for you and you can print those off. It makes it really very easy when you go to pay bills. It'll generate financial statements, create invoices. It'll maintain a list of vendors and customers. It'll manage lines of credit, credit cards. They're offering cloud-based services now and many, many more. I will say the entry of it is not always easy getting it set up. Again, there's some help out there with QuickBooks Pro. Intuit has some great videos on getting started. Sitting down and playing with the software. I mean, when you open it up and it looks like this, it could be very intimidating. So it does take some time to sit down. I would say you're going to spend a lot of time on the front end getting something like this set up. But once it's set up, it will manage itself. I've used Quicken for my personal accounts, and you can connect it with your credit cards. You can connect it with your bank account, and it will sync those fairly easily. And then you would go through and just classify those income and expenses as different categories that you wanted to track. So again, QuickBooks and Quicken, I think, has a high abandonment rate because often people don't sit down and carve out the time that they need to put this together. But again, in the end, it can be very, very helpful for financial record keeping. Lastly, I wanted to talk some about apps. There are a ton of apps out there for farm record keeping, for farm information, for farm sales. Just a little bit of information. You know, if you're going to use an app, make sure you go to Google Play or your iTunes store. You want to purchase it directly from those. That way you won't get a bogus app, or you won't be getting something that may have a virus. Be sure to read the reviews. The apps are rated, and people write whether they were helpful, if they did or didn't work. So all the apps have reviews, and that's very helpful. This farms.com has over 500 apps listed. It's probably the most comprehensive farm app listing I've ever seen. And it's got sort of a rating on those. It'll show you what the icon looks like. That way when you go into the Play Store, you don't spend forever trying to figure out which app it was. And again, they're categorized by, I think, farm record keeping, livestock, crops, spraying, and have that categorized on there. And I think they also have ratings on that one as well. So again, to stress, no one notebook software app is going to meet all your farm record keeping needs. You're going to need some type of mix, and I think that everyone uses some type of mix of written and electronic record keeping software. And so going through and trying to figure out at least minimum record keeping requirements, and then figuring out what do I need to make decisions on the farm. And starting off, it might just be your production records and what you planted and what the varieties are and how much they cost for the seed, how they yielded, on up to what those input expenses are. You know, I've seen people keep, you know, they keep fuel logs, they keep labor logs, so they can really keep detailed records. And that is it right now for farm record keeping, an overview of farm records. Again, we're recording this. If you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat pod. I'll also be saving this PowerPoint, the slides on the website as well, and everyone that registered will receive the link. Any questions out there about farm record keeping, or maybe something more specific to one of the spreadsheets I was discussing today? I keep a number of records for the farm. I help manage a couple farms, and every year the records kind of get changed or tweaked, and that's okay. I think that's what's going to happen as you look at them more and say, I'd really like to look at my production from this standpoint or that standpoint. Trying to get it organized. This is a great time of year to start thinking about it, so you can be ready for January 1. So going through your receipts this year, organizing them, working with your accountant, working with a QuickBooks Pro, working with Excel, and the help features that are on there are very helpful. Yes, there's a question about Quicken or QuickBooks. A lot of community colleges will do some basics with Quicken or QuickBooks. I think there may be even some trial versions that you could download that you could just play with and get some comfort level to. So that's very, very helpful. So there's another question about templates to share on daily farm journals. That's a great question. I know one of my good friends, her dad has written in a farm journal ever since he started farming. He writes daily in a farm journal. And, you know, I never asked her what he puts in those farm journals, whether it was just, you know, weather or market-based, what was happening on the farm. But that is a great question. And, you know, I think that the one nice thing about having it down on paper is great, but the ability to have something electronic where you can start looking at trends over the year or have access to data very quickly is one thing that like something like QuickBooks. So if, say I paid my propane bill and they rebuild me, I can very quickly go and see all of the bills that I've paid for propane, or I can see where it's increased over a year or I've decreased over the year. There's a question about websites or blogs where local farmers can share experiences with apps and QuickBooks. There is a farm blog, and I have a couple producers in my county that use it. You kind of get a handle. It's similar to a Twitter account where you don't use your name, and you can get posted on there. I cannot remember what that farm blog's name is, but I know who I could ask. There are some out there, probably not necessarily apps and QuickBooks, but it's something where you could post it's like a chat room similar, and you could ask questions. Does anyone on here know the name of that blog where you can ask questions? I know he uses it for production information, so and enjoys listening to what's happening. So it's a corn and soybean grower here on the Eastern Shore, so can find out what's happening in the Midwest, what the weather's like, where they're at with planting and harvesting, disease, pests, pressures. Mostly they've been talking about production, but I'm sure there's been people that have shared the apps and QuickBooks. Other questions? All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and I'll wait a little bit longer to see if